In a world where talent is evenly distributed, but venture capital is concentrated in coastal silos, smart startup money is heading for the Midcontinent. Welcome to the Midcon Markup, a podcast that uncovers the inspiring stories of our visionary tech entrepreneurs and the investors who believe in them. I'm your host, Cody Merrill with Cortado Ventures. Listen, learn, and make your Midcon Markup.
Welcome to another episode of the Midcon Markup. Today, we're fortunate to be joined with a special guest on site at Simple Modern with the CEO, Mike Beckham.
Great to be with you.
So, Mike, you have a really interesting background, had some success in tech before you got into a physical product business. Before we talk about the most recent professional experiences, I'd be really interested to hear about your upbringing, formative experiences that you had, maybe some early entrepreneurial experiences. What led you to pursue this unconventional career path that has led to outsized success, having this gorgeous building, this beautiful family, employees who seem to love you, and a local community who greatly appreciates what you've built?
So I'm not typical. I'm not the kid who had the lemonade stand when he was 6. I did not view myself as very entrepreneurial growing up. My brother was much more entrepreneurial than I was. Some of it, honestly, was I just wasn't very motivated by money. I realized that pretty early on that was not a big motivation for me. I do think each of us takes some key kind of things from our parents. There's kind of major lessons that they teach us that we take on. And one of the things about my parents, they were both in the mental health profession, is that they told us several times we did not pick the jobs where we felt like we could make the most money, because you don't get into mental health if you want to make money. But they picked the jobs that they did because they wanted to help people. And I do think at some kind of a deep level, I'm an Enneagram 3, which means I tend to frame things in terms of that meaning and value comes from accomplishment, which isn't always healthy, but it's the way that my brain tends to want to frame things. And the definition of what accomplishment is actually matters a lot if you do reading about that personality type. And my family really, I think, went a long way towards forming that I wanted to be about accomplishment, and I was very driven, but accomplishment in my family growing up was defined as helping people, which is really helpful for me. And so I wasn't particularly motivated by money growing up, and I don't have a lot of great entrepreneurial stories from my childhood, but I always did pretty well in school, and that led to me getting a full ride when I went to college. I got an SAT score that allowed me to have a full ride to OU. One of the things that I've reflected on quite a bit is that I just happened to be born in an era where my intuitiveness and my quantitative skills lined up with the rise of the internet. And I don't know, if I'm born in the 1500s, I don't know, maybe I'm just a regular farmer, like surf, I don't know. But I happen to be born in a period of history where the internet uniquely, I think, interfaces with some of the skills that I have. And I didn't recognize that immediately. And the internet really wasn't in full swing when I graduated high school in 1998. So I'm in this transitional generation. I didn't have my first smartphone until I was in my 30s. But the rise of the internet happened as I became an adult. And after college, I actually worked for several years in a full-time nonprofit. I worked in a ministry role, and that surprisingly provided a lot of building blocks that you would not think, hey, if you wanted to be a successful entrepreneur, then you should go and work in a nonprofit. You should go work in ministry. But surprisingly, that helped quite a bit, set me up. I wouldn't have been able to tell you all this at the time, but by the time I got to my 30th birthday, I hadn't done anything really obviously entrepreneurial, but there were all these building blocks from my life that had created, I think, some opportunity for me to do it, and to do it differently, to do it effectively, that I didn't even recognize. And then when opportunity presented itself, it started to become pretty obvious. The one piece that I think I did know is that when I took my first finance class, it just resonated at a level that I was like, wow, this is like a natural thing. Like this is the way that my brain works. And so there's a lot of, I think, like I mentioned, the quantitative and financial sides of my brain that like the internet, it really worked out well with. But I didn't have anything entrepreneurial, any businesses really that I did until when I was 30. My brother, who is a couple years younger than me, he had graduated and he had been doing some kind of one-man entrepreneurial things and done pretty well. He approached me and said, "Hey, will you help me start something a little bit bigger?" And so I helped him recruit some people. One of them was my best friend from high school. And we had an idea for an e-commerce kind of auction website concept. And really what I committed to was helping 2 or 3 hours a week, like nights and weekends. And what it turned into was more like a 40 plus hour a week second job because that company was way more successful than we thought it would be. But in a lot of ways, it caught me off guard. And so my introduction into building companies and entrepreneurship was not as premeditated as many people. But then once I got into it, I realized how much I loved it.
Can we talk a little bit more about Quibids? I think that was a very interesting business model. It was before its time. I think some copycats came out. But I would love to know, like from the inception of the idea to your brother having this spark, this audacity to say, "Hey, you know what? I think I can execute that," to then the like early steps of putting that together.
So I'm in my 15th year probably of company building. And in those 15 years, I would say that 13 of them maybe, I've been a part of companies that are growing at faster than 40%, 50%. So like I've really been on the front lines of scaling, had some crazy experiences. Nothing really comes close to the Quibids experience for a lot of reasons. When we started the company, we had this idea and there were a couple other people playing around with this concept, but we had a way that we thought we could do it better. And when you come up with a startup idea, you're not necessarily thinking like, oh, this is going to be a huge success, or I'm going to be doing this for the next 7 or 8 years. You're just like, hey, is this an interesting idea? Do I want to work on this? And that's pretty much all that we had. And one of the things that was really crazy about that experience was we launched the company October 23rd, 2009. I remember the exact date because I had a financial model, and that was always the first line item on it. By Thanksgiving of 2010, so that would have been about 13 months in, we had our first $1 million revenue day. So we scaled in 13 months from inception to $1 million revenue days. And I was the oldest person at the company. I was 30, right? Maybe turned 31 by that Thanksgiving that I'm referencing. And so it was a little bit like The Social Network, that movie where it's like, just the true Silicon Valley, like, kids that don't know any better, building something that gets to really big scale really quick. And I think it was, in many ways, it was the first time that I understood the truly awesome scale and scalability of the internet, that you can come up with something and then like literally millions of people in a very short period of time can be exposed to it. The numbers, the revenue, the amount of people we were hiring, everything was pretty overwhelming. The website, the office had a bunch of Nerf guns everywhere. We originally actually had an office that was for like 10 or 15 people. And we had a whole room that was like a game room with a big screen and stuff. And we thought this will be great. And within 2 or 3 months, like we had so many people crammed in this office that we had to kind of make the windows opaque because we were probably violating fire codes, and then we had to move to a new office. So it was like all the things that you associate with like the crazy scaling stories. Almost everybody that worked at the company early on either went to the same high school as my brother and I, or were in the same fraternity as my brother and I, because we were just grabbing anybody we could. We were growing that fast. So learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes, and had a lot of successes. And you learned about what it's like to have enough success that you just think everything you touch is going to turn to gold. Learned about how to make mistakes where you can set millions of dollars on fire. really learned about building culture and the ramifications in a startup when you make certain trade-off decisions. So it was probably one of the most formative experiences of my life. I mean, I learned about working with family. In that company, my brother was the CEO, and I held some different roles. At one point, I was in charge of analytics. At another point, I was in a COO role. And my brother and I had some great moments and some epic arguments along the way. In a lot of ways, actually, it's interesting that experience made he and I's relationship stronger, but it definitely introduced a ton of adversity. And so I just learned so much. I tell people that period was kind of like getting an MBA on crack, where it was just like the experience, the density of experience, the intensity of the emotions and the work. It was really strong. And I would say was very formative in everything about how we've built Simple Modern, because there's a lot of research that second-time founders, do really well. And there's a lot of reasons for that, like understanding a bunch of the fundamentals. But for me, I think understanding how I wanted to use my time and understanding how the kind of culture that I wanted to build were a couple of big takeaways. The other thing that came from that is that I had been working in full-time ministry before that, and then I was kind of thrust into this situation where I hadn't been in the business world, but we were growing really quickly, and I needed to have a bunch of skills. And so I really did develop, I think, a bunch of the competencies and skill sets that I would need to lead a company. And that wasn't always easy. That was challenging. So got the full experience, learned a ton about technology, as you mentioned. This is interesting because when we started that company, this would have been 2009. I mean, this is pre-AWS. This is when, if you wanted to have a website, you literally had servers, and like you would have to go buy a cage in Atlanta or somewhere to keep those servers, and those servers would depreciate, or sometimes they would melt. I mean, it was like really crazy stuff like that, which if you're building a technology company today, you don't think about, all the infrastructure and all the difficulties, but that stuff didn't exist. There was no Shopify, like it was like everything was custom built. And so I kind of came up in a period where the technological backbone and infrastructure was still coming together. The iPhone had just been released. The iPad got released, I think, a few months after we launched. The App Store was in its infancy. So it was a really formative period in tech, and building a startup during that period, I think was incredibly helpful in terms of my understanding of technology, and also like where the opportunities would be in the future.
So can you explain a little bit more about exactly what the Quibids business was?
It was an online auction website. The difference from eBay was that you bought credits to be able to bid on things, and the pricing on the auction started at 1 cent. So you had to pay for your bids, but then if you won things way below market value. And if you didn't win, you could apply all of the credits that you'd use towards bidding on something. You could apply those towards buying it at its regular retail price. This was actually a really interesting, I think, education for me, and anybody building a tech product. I read this once, and it resonated with me, that when they made Twitter, they never probably considered, hey, this tool will probably be used by extremists to coordinate terrorist attacks, for example, or be used to spread hate and misinformation. But those things happened. And this is the problem with any product that you do, is that once you create something and bring it into the world, especially with technology, you lose the ability to totally control how people are going to use it. You have desires, obviously, and you can kind of try and structure it where it's used the way you encourage people, you incentivize people to use it the way that you want them to use it, but you can't force them to do that. And so we had this model where at one negative extreme, people could use it almost as like a form of gambling, where like they're just like trying to win something really cheap, and if they don't, then they just walk away. And we tried to really heavily incentivize them to use this much more like a regular shopping mechanism, but it was tough. And I think that was one takeaway I had, is that the amount that you can change human behavior is limited. And so when you're building a technology product or building a company in general, you have to be okay with a certain level of people are going to take this and use this in unexpected ways, good and bad, that I can't anticipate. So we struggled with that, I think, through the life of the company, of trying to get users to use this as a shopping mechanism the way that we wanted them to use it. But the company was very successful. I mean, it did over $1 billion in revenue in about a 7 or 8 year period. It doesn't exist anymore, but it had a really high highs, and we learned a lot through the process. And I think it was significant because, kind of to my knowledge, it was really the first major technology company in Oklahoma City, or at least like kind of consumer-facing technology company in Oklahoma City. One of the things that's interesting from that also is that there are a lot of alums that have gone on to do really significant things. If you look at e-commerce and you say, well, where are the people that are making a big impact in e-commerce? What's their background? Where do they come from? Well, of course, you've got Amazon, you've got a couple of other major companies from coastal cities. And then randomly, you've got things like Quibids, where there are quite a few people that have gone on to do significant things. And randomly, it all goes back to this experience in Oklahoma City that a bunch of them had together. But I think this is because the nature of entrepreneurship and is so much caught more than it is taught. It's being around an environment where people are doing it well. And then you almost, by observing and by osmosis and by imitation, you learn what it takes to be successful. So that's one of the cool legacies of that company, is that a lot of people who were a part of that journey have gone on to do really significant things.
One of the things that strikes me about the business model is how genius your user journey is. I feel like the user experience, like the thoughtfulness that goes into your sales process, where you provide people an opportunity to sort of play a game, have an opportunity to win something for significantly below market value, but by virtue of them committing some dollar towards their goal of winning that prize, you have a little foot in the door, like a psychological framework where there's an escalatory commitment, and it helps them walk themselves through the sale to eventually make the purchase in the overwhelming odds that they don't win the auction.
So it was interesting because we had several high-level PhDs use our data sets to do interesting work about things like sunk cost fallacy and economic behavior of people. I would say this: I learned a heck of a lot about how people think and how people function. There was a different time in my life where I thought about becoming a PhD in finance. And so the more academic side of me found it super interesting to watch behavior of what people do over really big data sets. And I think that model of gamification, I think I would distill it this way, that we clued in really early, 2009, 2010, into the role that gamification was going to play in the internet. What's interesting is we got it wrong. I mean, we had some success, but the really easy wins were there in plain sight. We just missed them. We were trying to map the gamification to shopping, which hasn't really happened. If you look at who's won, there's gamification elements that have been incorporated into commerce and how people shop, but not in massive ways. But at the same time, you had this rise of the App Store. What we never fully embraced was this idea that the gamification, that people would happily spend lots of money for gamification, just for gamification's sake, with no tangible, concrete reward. So we did a model where we tried to map this gamification to online shopping in a way where you'd put something in your cart, and then at checkout you'd be able to play a game and get a discount of somewhere between 5 and 20%, which we thought was a really interesting idea. And it just didn't work. It didn't resonate with people. But at the same time, you had the rise of companies like Supercell, and you had Candy Crush Saga and this stuff going crazy in the App Store, and you had some multi-billion-dollar companies built around gamification where people were happy to spend money on gamification for gamification's sake. So this is one of the hard things about entrepreneurship, I think, in general, is that if you build anything, you end up having enough surface area and things that you look at that you'll look back 5 or 10 years later and be like, my goodness, why did I not invest in that thing? Why didn't we go that direction instead of this direction? Really common one today, we're a big seller on Amazon. And one of the kind of classic jokes in the Amazon seller community is, if instead of starting to sell on Amazon, if you'd just taken all that money and bought Amazon stock, you'd probably be better off, And so it was like kind of right there in plain sight. You knew, hey, selling on Amazon's a great opportunity. But for most sellers, if they'd just taken that capital and bought Amazon stock, they would have capitalized on that insight even better. So there's definitely plenty of those for me. My brother and I had many, many ideas of how to invest money in kind of startup tech ideas, most of which we didn't pursue just because we didn't have the bandwidth. And 5-10 years later, we looked at some of these lists, and it's just like, oh yeah, that was a multi-billion-dollar opportunity that somebody took advantage of. That was a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. So we were very close without, I think, fully nailing it. But one of the things I've learned about entrepreneurship is success really does come from staying in the game and shots on goal. So what does that mean? That means, don't go bankrupt and keep taking swings. And eventually you're going to make good contact with something. And there will be a lot of things you missed that you feel like you should have hit. So my career is kind of a good illustration of this. Like I said, I'm in probably year 15 of being an entrepreneur. I've now, multiple billions of dollars in sales between the companies. They've all been bootstrapped. So I've got this, really abnormally positive outcome kind of track record. And that's one way that you could frame my career. Another way that you could frame it, which would be just as fair, is that I have been, this close to 50 opportunities, and I missed on 48 of them. But 2 of them I connected with, and that makes all the difference. And both are, I think, accurate ways of describing it. But I think when it comes to people that want to develop as entrepreneurs and want to make careers of entrepreneurship, I think it's much more helpful to describe it as the second way. Instead of saying, like, I'm one of the winners where everything's kind of gone my way, to say most things have actually not gone my way. But I've gotten so many kind of shots on goal, and I've stayed in the game, that it hasn't mattered. And I've had 2 really huge successes that I've gotten to be a part of.
So in terms of not going bankrupt and shots on goal,
yeah.
So you're trying to increase your surface area of luck. You're trying to give yourself more opportunity to really connect big. Is that on a personal and a company level, right? Because
sure,
maybe one company fails and then you move on to the next one.
Sure. Yeah. I think
us mere mortals.
Well, I mean, I think survivorship bias is a real thing. And I think I have a responsibility in the way that I talk about my career and the success I've had to describe it accurately. So on one side, that's like, I don't want to understate how difficult it is to have the kind of outcomes we've had. I am obsessive. I have worked really hard. There have been a lot of nights where it's 3 a.m. and I'm working on something. When I'm on vacation, I'm never 100% off. My brain still turns things over. And people should expect this, like the level of dedication and buy-in, financial sacrifice that you need to be willing to make to build something like this. It is immense. It is difficult. If it was easy, a lot of people would do it. A lot of people like the idea of entrepreneurship, but they're actually not willing to pay the cost that it requires. But with that said, I also don't want to tell the story where it's, I'm so special and that's why I've had all these outcomes, and it's not replicable, and it's only for, like you said, it's only for the few. I do think there are so many principles of what we've done that are replicable. They won't necessarily turn into, $500 million companies, but they can turn into successful things that really add value to society. So I think for me, part of the answer is staying in the game. Obviously, there's like a financial component of, hey, if you run out of money, then, you have to go get more money, or you have to raise funding or whatever, and that can take you out of the game. The other thing that can take you out of the game, I think, is just not managing yourself very well. So this is not taking care of your body, not taking care of your mental health, not having things outside of work that bring meaning and purpose. This is one of the areas where I've probably been pretty strong, is that there have been ups and downs throughout the journey, but by being intentional with managing myself and investing in things outside of entrepreneurship, I've actually extended my window. So an easy way of thinking about this, even with my current company, Simple Modern, the first 15 hires or so, 14 out of those 15 I had known for a decade or more. And there's a lot of reasons why that's been significant and that's helped. But one of the most simple is that I just like being here. And because I just like being here, my time horizon. You'll hear people talk about having kind of the longest view, or having the longest time horizon of anybody. Investors will say this all the time. Sam Hinkie, famously talked about this when he was with the 76ers. But how do you actually do that, right? And one of the ways you do that is you create situations that you just enjoy being in, that you're not feeling anxious, you're not feeling antsy. So for me, one of the reasons why I've been able to be as successful as I have, especially in Simple Modern and the current venture, is that I am surrounded by an environment that I love. And so I can have a 20, 30-year time horizon in terms of how I think about things, because I intend to sit in this seat probably until I retire. And I can do that because I really enjoy the mission and the culture and the people that I'm surrounded by. And so my competitors don't have that. By and large, my competitors are either they're public or they're owned by somebody. They have shareholders that are thinking in quarters. At most, they're thinking in terms of years. I can think in terms of decades. And the reason why I have that luxury is because of the environment that I've created. So this is actually one of the most powerful things you can do, is manage yourself and manage your environment, manage your culture, manage your mission in such a way where you can really have longevity. Because the easiest way to kind of expand that surface area of luck is to expand the time horizon that you're getting. So anyway, that's been a really powerful piece of advice that I've had other people give to me, and I would give to anybody listening to this, is finding something that you can do for a really long time really ups your chances of success. And this is also, we're saying, in the tech world, a lot of times we kind of worship these things that are seemingly overnight successes. But usually in entrepreneurship, even in tech, the successes are, the overnight successes, quote unquote, are 5 years in the making, 10 years in the making. And you need to be prepared for that kind of a journey.
So what are your hobbies outside of work? Like, what is your process for managing your physical, emotional wellness?
So the first thing I'll say is a little bit counterintuitive, which is the most successful entrepreneurs I know, work takes on a unique role in their life where it feels like a hobby. So I really enjoy puzzle solving as one of the things that kind of makes me come alive and is just interesting to me. And because of that, my work does feel like a hobby a lot of times. I'm a person that likes asking questions and likes trying to use data or other information to answer those questions. And my job provides a ton of those opportunities. So that's one example, is that the kind of work enjoyment barrier, it gets fuzzier with a lot of the most successful entrepreneurs I know, because they really enjoy working on their business. It's not that they are workaholics. It's not that they, feel like they have to, or they're just that driven. It's that they actually enjoy it. So there's a lot of times where, like, I'll play around in a spreadsheet, or I'll be thinking about something with work, but it's more because, like, that's the most fun thing I can think of to do right then. But I think relationships have been, I would say, I don't know if that makes sense, but in terms of hobbies, like really investing in relationships. My core family, my wife, my 2 kids are a big part of that. But I've been pretty intentional with friendships. There's a lot of research that says, I'm 44. It's crazy. It's like 44-year-olds in this country, 20% of them would say they don't have a single friend outside of their immediate family. And then another large percentage would say, maybe I have one. And me having core friendships that I've maintained and that I invest in, that's been a big, and that's not so much what we do together, although it's like we go to sports games and, things like that. But it's just that I actually have people that I invest in. I've gotten pretty serious about exercise. That's been a big one for me. I actually, when I would turn 25, 26, I was not in very good shape. I'm in much better shape at 44 than I was at 25 or 26. And that's made a big difference for me. I think one of the things that I've observed as I've gotten into my mid-40s is that it's really a point where you start to understand the power of compounding in people's lives for good or for worse. So there will be people that that have continued to invest in their bodies, they've continued to invest in relationships, they've continued to invest in their intellect, that you haven't seen in a few years, and you see them and you're just like, wow, that's amazing. That's amazing how that's grown over time and the person they're turning into. And then there'll be other people that you knew from high school or college, and you interact with them and you realize they haven't, and that they've kind of been in this stasis or this stagnation. And I think the quality of life and satisfaction with where you are in life has a lot to do with those things. So I mentioned this, but I don't know, it's not what people would typically say when they say hobbies, like golf, but it's like, I enjoy learning. Learning is a hobby for me. And in different seasons, what I'm learning about looks different, but I find learning enjoyable. I find it enjoyable to be around other people who enjoy the process of learning. This is probably another one of those, the easiest way you can really pick out people that are likely to eventually be successful. This curiousness and desire to learn is really high up on the list. I mean, really what you're doing with entrepreneurship is you are trying to solve a problem for people. You're serving people by solving a problem. And the worst entrepreneurs in my experience are people that are just trying to figure out, how do I get the outcome I want? And how do I get, if I did this, could I get people to buy it? How do I get customers to behave the way that I want them to behave so that I get the outcome I want? The most effective entrepreneurs tend to approach things from a very different perspective of, what are systemic problems? What are ways that people could be served better? How can I create value? And then almost inevitably that ends up turning into great customer behavior and good economic outcomes, but they're coming at it from a very different perspective. And again, I think this ties back to learning and curiosity. And so for me, I really enjoy asking questions about, why do people behave the way that they do, and what would make people's lives better, and how do we function as humans? And then the intersection of that in business is super fascinating to me. So like I said, I've got some traditional stuff. Like I enjoy the Thunder. I try to go to Thunder games, and I like OU football and all that stuff. But a lot of my hobbies are probably atypical in the sense that they're based on trying to either build my body, my intellect, my relationships, that kind of stuff.
Okay, a few things to follow up on there. Book recommendations for understanding human behavior.
Oh man. So there's so many great books out there, and I would kind of break it into, I'll tell you what, in the show notes, I have a list of probably 30 of them that I recommend. The spiritual side of my life is really important. And I think regardless of whether or not you would define yourself as a Christian or even as a spiritual person, I think that there is something pretty important and pretty powerful about being introspective and reflective about that area of your life. Because me having a clear worldview and a clear sense of purpose are pretty bound up together. And my observation about entrepreneurship, I am going to get to the answer to this question, but my sense of entrepreneurship is that a lot of what makes successful entrepreneurs successful is that they're able to attract other successful people, and that comes from them having a clear sense of who they are and where they're going. So for me, my faith has been a bedrock of who I am as a person, but I think it's also been a big part of my success because it has made me a person that other people want to work with and that other people are willing to follow. So in the spiritual area, like one book that there's a couple by a guy named Tim Keller that I would recommend that are really good. One is called The Reason for God, and one is called The Prodigal God. They're really easy books to read, and they're super interesting. Keller is a very smart guy. He's a 150 plus IQ type of guy. So he really comes at spirituality and faith from a very kind of first principles and intellectual place, which was helpful for me. I think when it comes to entrepreneurship, some books that I've really enjoyed, Phil Knight has a biography called Shoe Dog, which is about him building Nike, which is really entertaining and engaging. We read that book right as we were first building the company, so it was really fun. We were building a consumer company, and that book. Peter Thiel has a book called 0 to 1 that is really, really good. Again, it's kind of more first principles thinking about how do you pick the markets, what are you trying to engage in. I read a lot of biographies. Biographies are great because they give you an opportunity to look at the totality of somebody's life and to learn a lot of the things that they had to learn through experience and hardship, and you get them for free. So there have been quite a few biographies that I've read. I think a couple of them that are worth reading. For me, I really enjoyed reading about Rockefeller. Philanthropy was a big part of his life. He's very, he's a very interesting guy. He had a faith component to his life. He had a big philanthropy component, and then he was pretty ruthless on the business side. And so there were parts of him that I really liked and thought were admirable, and then there were other parts I didn't. And so being able to read about him, I really find it interesting how I'm situated today. I like reading about people that have been successful in business and seeing how they handled their wealth and their relationships with their family. And some have done a really good job, some have done a really poor job. So I'm trying to be really intentional in that area. I think like the Hamilton biography by Chernow that they turned into the musical Hamilton is great. And it's another example of just a very interesting, complicated person where there's a lot of things that you admire and there's a lot of things that you don't, and that you can read it and really have some takeaways about the way that you want to live your life. So there's a lot of biographies out there. I've probably read 50 in the last few years, and those have been really helpful. Are
you a print reader, e-reader,
yeah,
audiobook
I do
reader?
Audible
Okay.
because I can put it at 2x, and like I can multitask.
I'm a 2Xer.
Yeah. So it's funny actually. I'm friends with David Sinra, who runs the Founders Podcast, and he was telling me he's the exact inverse of that. He will actually physically read it, and he'll reread pages 5 times. And so it's like I can see that sometimes it's not just the quantity of information we put in our brain, but it's like the level of absorption that we get that's more important. But it does help me to be able to get a lot of content, and I'm able to pair it with working out really nicely. So there's a couple of great books about Amazon. I mean, I think Bezos is one of those guys where you should read about Bezos and you should learn about him, especially if you're in tech. I mean, Amazon obviously has turned into one of the 2 or 3 kind of definitional companies of our lifetimes. But it is super interesting, their decision to really lean all the way into APIs and eventually develop AWS is foundational to the way that tech works today. And so there's one called Working Backwards. There's one called the Everything Store that are both really good for kind of getting inside of the way that they've made decisions. So I could give a lot of different recommendations. I like Good to Great a lot, and Built to Last. I think those have some really good thoughts. So there's a lot of stuff. I could probably give 50 recommendations, but those are just a few that jump to mind.
Okay, cool. Well, definitely would love to follow up in show notes and include as many of these great books as possible. I also enjoy reading. So you've made an entrepreneurial switch that most people don't, in that you had a huge amount of success with Quibids, online business exclusively, no physical product, no inventory management. And then you decided that based on that experience, based on what you learned, the business that you wanted to go start and be the CEO of was a physical product business. Walk us back through that thought process. Were there any other business ideas that you were considering before you went all in on Simple Modern, and what was the original vision of Simple Modern?
So, okay. I guess I would start here. When I got to about 2015, my brother and I had started several businesses. We'd done a bunch of stuff together, but I really felt like I was either probably going to go back into the nonprofit world, or I wanted to build a fairly radically different type of business. And radically different in terms of the kind of purpose and culture. So it's been said sometimes that when it comes to startups in the business world, this is actually a Bezos thing, that you've got missionaries and mercenaries. And he's not using it in a spiritual sense, but basically the idea that you have people that are kind of in it to make good money and to see what they can extract. And you've got people that are ideologically kind of in it. They're in it for reasons other than, even you were just telling me about, your startup, and like that was an ideological startup. You're a missionary. And the thing about missionaries is that they're ideologically motivated, and they tend to deal with adversity quite a bit better because, again, they're not in it for what's the best deal for me. They're in it because there's something bigger that they feel like they're trying to accomplish. So ideologically, that's definitely who I am. And I got to a point where I wanted to be able to say that I was making some kind of a positive impact on the world, not just that I was building a successful business. And so I was ready for a change. There were a couple guys that had worked directly under me at Quibids, and Brian and Micah, and they took me to lunch one day at Chick-fil-A and just said, "Hey, if you ever wanted to start something, we've loved working with you. We love the culture in our department. We'd love to do it with you if you ever did." And I hadn't thought about it with those guys before, but that was an appealing idea. And as we started to kind of kick around ideas about what this could be or what it could look like, it's interesting because the things we had conviction about at the very beginning.
Yeah, so at this point in time, had you had an exit from Quibids?
Not a Quibids, but it had produced enough free cash flow that I would describe myself as I had no debt and I had some money in the bank. It wasn't like I don't need to work again, but it was also like I was in a financial position where I could think a little bit more flexibly.
You were comfortable enough to take risk.
Yeah, and I think this gets brought up a lot, that it's hard to compare people that are differently situated sometimes, because even the ability to bootstrap something does depend on your previous financial condition. And one of the things that I'll tell people that are aspiring to be entrepreneurs is that I think the most successful formula, if there is one, is that you spend your 20s and your early 30s building capital. You want to be building relational capital. So you're making connections with other people who are high capacity, talented people. You want to be building your intellectual capital. So you are developing real skill sets, real expertise in areas, and you want to be building your financial capital. And that you amass enough of those things that when you get a really good opportunity, you can kind of unload the clip of your relational, financial, and intellectual capital at an idea. This is really what happened for me with Simple Modern, is that I had built up enough of those three things that when I found an opportunity that was suitable, when I found a good enough opportunity, I was really prepared to take a very big swing at something. And that ended up being what happened with the formation of the company, is that I was approached by these two guys. We kind of started actually from what's the type of culture, what's the type of mission that we want to create. What would it be like to work inside of this company? And we knew we would do something that was at least adjacent to e-commerce, because we'd been a part of a lot of e-commerce sales. But we got to the part of what the product would be and exactly how we would do it later. That came several months in. We started with, hey, what would it be like to work inside of this company and to be a part of this company? And then, okay, how are we going to fund that? And actually, drinkware was not the first thing that we tried. We tried a couple of other things. We did have a pretty strong conviction that we wanted to sell on Amazon. At this point, this would have been 2015, it was really obvious that Amazon had won the e-commerce race. And being able to sell on the Amazon marketplace, we'd seen a lot of opportunities that could be that there was still a lot of opportunity there, but we didn't know what we wanted to sell. So we tried actually a couple of other things and had just enough success that we felt like, hey, we're on the right path. We just don't have the right product yet. And then in March of 2016, which would have been about 9 months in, we sold our first water bottle on Amazon. And I think we knew almost immediately. It's also worth saying, the first 9 months of the company, we were working other jobs. This was totally a kind of nights and weekends endeavor. And so when we sold our first water bottle, I think it became obvious pretty quickly, number one, this is what product market fit looks like. And this is what we want to scale. And I was prepared at that point, as I mentioned earlier, to unload the clip. I had people that I thought I could go hire. I had money that I was ready to invest. I had some skill sets, even some skill sets that I wouldn't have anticipated. For example, being in ministry for several years, I've actually gotten really good at sales. And I had never thought about that. And in Quibids, that hadn't really come up because it was all B2C. But there's a pretty big B2B sales kind of aspect of running a brand if you're going to work with the Walmarts and the Targets of the world. And I realized I had some skill sets there. So once we realized that there was some real opportunity in product market fit, we swung pretty hard, pretty quick.
So water bottle
Sure.
seems to be not that many steps removed from paperclip when it comes to a commodity. Why did those first customers on Amazon buy your water bottles?
Yeah, so I really emphasized to people that this seemed like a very stupid idea to many people around me for exactly the reason that you said, because it was, number one, this is a highly commoditized category. Heard that a bunch. And then number two, if you're not trying to do the commodity thing, Yeti existed, Hydro Flask existed. There were some premium brands that could crush us with their capital. And so people just didn't get it at all. Like, why is this a good idea? And one thing that I would kind of emphasize here, we'll use the paperclip analogy. One thing that's great about highly competitive markets is they're usually, not always, in tech we've seen this isn't always the case, but usually they're highly competitive because there's a lot of customers. And so, it's a double-edged sword. Yes, you're going to have to find a way to compete, and yes, it's going to be hard, but also the number of customers that are ready to spend money on your product is very large. And as anybody who's tried to launch into a space where there weren't a lot of willing customers, I think that I've always felt like that's a harder problem to solve. It's always hard. Yeah, I mean, you just told me your story. It's always harder to convince people to spend money or that they need to think about spending money on something that they've never spent money on than it is to say, people are showing up every single day and buying, millions of water bottles. How do I come in and effectively serve some of that market? And so one of the biggest misconceptions, I beat this drum a lot because I think it's one of the more counterintuitive things that I've observed, is most entrepreneurship students that I teach or that I interact with, they're kind of obsessed with coming up with a novel idea. And the reason they're obsessed with that is that their perspective is, I need to stay away from competition. If I can stay away from competition, then I have a much higher chance of success. And okay, that's in some ways true. But what's also true is if you actually find a product where there's not competition that you're trying to sell, there's a very good chance it's because nobody wants it. Like, if you think about it just logically, if you try to sell a product that nobody else is trying to sell, there's two options. One is that a bunch of other people have actually tried to sell that product and there's just not a market. Or that you're just the first person in 8 billion people to have this idea and, good for you. But most of the time, it's not that it's truly a novel idea. I mean, I think I'm more and more like, I don't know that there is nothing new under the sun. There's not really truly novel ideas that when there's not sales happening in a market, unless there's been some kind of major technological disruption, it's because there's actually not a market there. Now, sometimes I think the idea that you shared with me earlier, there's a progression that hasn't happened yet and you can be a pioneer, but it's hard being a pioneer. That is difficult. And most companies that are trying to pioneer and cultivate demand in a new area fail. So ironically, going where competition is actually one of the ways to increase your chances of being successful at some level. That 99% of successful businesses have not kind of invented the wheel, but rather they've either said, I'm going to take the wheel to a new customer, or I'm going to do it through a new distribution channel, or I'm going to, give them a slightly different version of the wheel than's available on the market, and have been really successful. I mean, even the companies that we kind of hold up on a pedestal as being very innovative, there are innovative things about them. Like Apple, there are innovative things about Apple, but most of what Apple's come out with is really they've just looked at markets and looked at things that already existed, and they've done them, they've done them better. They've done them at a higher quality or at a higher design aesthetic. And it's like Netflix didn't invent the idea of movies. They just changed up the distribution of movies, and that was enough. That was pretty revolutionary. So we were in a really highly competitive market, but we were able to see two things. One is I knew that we could not beat Yeti at what Yeti was doing. That was impossible. If we try to compete for the same audiences and the same channels at the same price points, like we are going to get smoked, and this thing isn't going to work.
So they own the premium tumbler.
And specifically,
market.
They owned particular distribution methods and a particular demographic. Like if you're a male that likes to be outdoors, that shops in, whatever, Dick's Sporting Goods or, Academy or whatever, Cabela's or Bass Pro, like you're at the heart of Yeti's demographic, and you're not going to have any success attacking that or trying to compete there. But what we observed was when it came to channels, e-com, especially Amazon, had been underemphasized by several of our competitors because they'd made their money in physical retail and specialty retail. That price point wise, they gravitated towards, higher price points. There was an opportunity for a mid-market kind of player, that they were not focused on the fashion element of it. Again, if your core demographic with Yeti, for example, is men, you're not going to be as focused on having a whole bunch of different colors because that doesn't matter as much to men. And so the way that I would illustrate this concept is I like to do a little bit of a mental game where if I'm trying to figure out what our strategy should be, I will actually start by pretending I'm the CEO of all of our competitors and thinking about what are all the resources and positioning that I have with my company and what strategy would I be employing to maximize my effectiveness. And if you go through that mental exercise where you think through how you would run all of your competitors, and then you come back to yourself, what starts to be, I would say, more evident is where the white space potentially exists. Where are the places where you can develop a strategy that is not as competitive and is more blue ocean with with the other companies that are in your space? Or where are the places where you can compete with somebody else's strategy head to head and you just have better positioning, better assets? So for us, we realized the fact that we could build with a digital first mindset would allow us to do things with our catalog in terms of how many SKUs we offered that would be very different than people that had built their companies on a physical distribution model. We realized that Amazon was probably underemphasized. We realized that price point was a place where we could create some separation. And it ended up we were being right. There was I would say, a central kind of aha insight that we thought this category would develop into a functional fashion category. Like I think watches are one of these, handbags, shoes, where you have to use these things like for practical purposes. Like you need to have a handbag to hold your things in it. But also there's a lot of different price points, a lot of different presentations, and how it looks matters almost as much as how it carries things. And this is exactly what has happened in hydration. I think that insight ended up being true, that women especially would use this as an accessory, that, does this go with my outfit? And so people weren't going to just buy one of these, but they would own multiple of these. I want this water bottle that goes with this outfit and I can take to the gym. I want this for my coffee and I want it to look like this. And so I end up having 6, 7, 8 of these in my cabinet. So we recognized that fairly on, and we leaned into it, and that ended up being really helpful. We got some initial traction on Amazon, and we started the company with $200,000 in bootstrapped funds. And basically the first few months were the moment that we got stuff in and it started to sell. We realized we didn't have enough. I'd turn around and place a purchase order that was as big as I thought I could go without putting us in financial danger. The moment I placed it, I'd be nervous. I'd wake up in cold sweat, like bankrupted us. And then the inventory would get in and we hadn't bought enough. And it was just like that on repeat for years. We were very hand to mouth. You mentioned this, but scaling in particular with a physical product is so much more difficult than with a digital product. With a digital product, if you, let's use SaaS as an example. If you build a software solution, like going from 1 customer to 100 customers is very, very low lift a lot of times. If you don't think about features that they're asking for, if you're just talking about the technological, kind of infrastructure and scaling that needs to happen, this is one of the reasons why the margins can be so amazing in software. Is as you scale, you just unlock all this efficiency. And there is some efficiency of scale in physical products, but it's so much more capital intensive because you have to buy all the inventory to fund the growth that you're hoping to have in the year ahead. So you have to make bets on how much growth do we think we're going to have, and then we have to buy the inventory. And that inventory is fairly binary. It's not enough to say we think we're going to sell $10 million of water bottles next year. You've got to have colors and you've got to have styles nailed, or you could have bought the right amount of inventory, but it's divided among your SKUs wrong, and that won't work. So very challenging. There have been points in the company. The way that our tax code works does not favor growing a company with inventory. Because you're paying taxes on your profit now, but you get no tax benefit for inventory you buy. So very hand to mouth for probably 4 or 5 years, where we had to be profitable from day one because we were bootstrapped, but 100% of the profits that we made were immediately going back into inventory, and we grew really fast. Our first year of really selling water bottles was 2016, so that would have been about 8 years ago. This year we'll do over 200 million in sales. So if you just start doing math and you start looking at the turns inventory wise, it's almost impossible. It's quite a gauntlet to actually scale up. And when you get inventory buys wrong, it really sets you back. It really stalls out your growth. In COVID, one of the things that really blew up a ton of physical product companies is that the supply chain just got nuked. So the amount of inventory you have to carry is based on your supply chain and how long you think it takes to move things around. If you think it's going to take 60 days to get something from, ordering it in China to your retailer or whatever, and you need to have $5 million in inventory to do it, what happens when it's actually going to take 120 days? Well, all of a sudden, you've got to find another $5 million in working capital just to have enough inventory in your supply chain. So COVID really put a bunch of physical product companies in a bad place from a capital structure, simply because things were taking longer to arrive. And we're battle tested at this point. We've got the scars to show for it. We've learned the lessons, and we've been able to come out the other side. But I definitely appreciate how difficult it is to build a physical product company. I think there's one kind of final concept that I would highlight here, which is in business, it's really tempting to say, I want to find the easiest way to make money. But the counterbalance to that is the easier it is to spin up a business, a piece of software, whatever, the more competition you're going to get if you're successful. And the harder it is the more moated you are. And so in our industry, for example, anybody can go and order a really high quality water bottle from China, for example. Anybody in the world, it's never been easier. You could match our product quality. You could match our pricing more or less within a month by buying things from China. But the distribution network and the supply chain management and the capital structure to do that and the brand to do that, those are actually pretty large moats, is what we've learned. And so even though it seems like paper clips, it's a lot of these pieces that actually make it not like paper clips at all.
Interesting. Okay, so product purchasing, it seems like that's where a lot of dollars can go to get burned. Yeah. But it's the most important decisions that you would make on a yearly basis is how much you're going to allocate to which SKU. And I'm imagining that these decisions are highly informed by data of historical sales, what's going on in the market. But there's a component to it that is a predictive component where there's a heuristic of where the market is moving. And that seems to be more of an art as opposed to a science. Yeah. Like, how does that conversation go in the office? Like, yeah. I imagine you have people who are very creative and they have this vision for where the world is going. And then you have some people who are more conservative, maybe from an accounting background, saying, no. Yeah. I only want to purchase what I know that we can turn to cash. Right. What is that process like for you? How do you think about it? And how good are you at that creative part? Is that what's made you so special?
It's a very insightful question because, as I mentioned, we're in a category that behaves a lot more like fashion than you would expect. Going back to the paper clips example, like paper clips don't change. You sound the same, more or less the same paper clips today they sold 20 years ago. With water bottles, it has changed a lot and it has become much more fashion driven. So it is much more qualitative. Here's the number one thing I've learned. Or I'll say there's two skills that make all the difference in the world. The first skill is the internet makes it possible to gather the opinions and feedback of people for very low cost or almost nothing, and to do it very quickly. So in terms of the amount of money it costs and the amount of time it costs, the ability to gather feedback of people is quicker than ever before. We've made a lot of use of surveying as an example here, where we can say, hey, we like these 100 colors. We can send it out to an email list and we can have 10,000 responses within an hour. So it's like, well, that's helpful. Imagine, that's never been possible in human history that you could get.
So is it a third-party company?
We do that. We do it internally.
Okay, so
and you can do this stuff externally, but we do stuff like that internally.
And that's based off your email list.
Yes. So, which is another example of an asset that we've built, but now is really helpful. Now, the problem with that can be sometimes, well, people might say they like it, but does that mean they'll buy it, right? So we've actually gone a step further recently. Like today, I think one of the things that's happening as we're recording this is we have gotten into doing drops on our website where we come up with designs and we do a limited quantity and we put them up for sale on our website. And so part of that is it's fun, limited edition stuff for our people, but part of that is we use it to actually test the demand for designs that we might want to go bigger with. And the ability to have domestic manufacturing has made all this possible. So it's interesting. Like one of my big kind of rules is that if you ask people their opinion, they will do their best. But if you ask people to vote with their wallet, you'll understand their real intent. And so we've moved more and more towards how do we actually test and sample and get insight by making people not just tell us what they think, but actually, take action. And that's really powerful. So I would say leveraging the internet and finding ways to put people in situations where they vote with their wallets are really good ways to get insights. But what you're really trying to do, this goes back to a concept from earlier, is you're really trying to learn about the market. You're learning about customers and how they think. And the reason why you're trying to learn is you're trying to build judgment. And I think that as much, I've really tried to build a culture here where we continue to develop more leaders, where we make things scalable, where more and more people can own processes. And yet, I think that whole process has taught me that good judgment is rare and it takes a long time to cultivate. And when people have it, that not everybody has it. And when you have people or groups of people that have really good judgment, you want to get them lots of information and you want to do a lot of testing, but at some point you just have to say, we're going to trust your judgment. And so there's some of that as well. Like we just recently went through our line review with Target, and we sell a lot of different things with Target. And, they're like, we want the freshest colors. We want what's next. And by definition, they want us to be bringing things to shelves that we haven't sold before, that we don't have kind of a pattern on, or a historical sales that we can draw off of. And they want to put it on shelves next May and it'll live there for a year. So they want to talk to us this summer about something that could be selling 23 months from now. And that takes projecting and judgment. And it, like you said, it's a lot more art than science some of the time. So I think we're continuing to build our muscles in that area, but the internet makes it easier than ever before to really interact with your customers. I said this earlier, but I'll emphasize it now. That fundamentally entrepreneurship is you solve a problem for people, you serve customers, and they pay you for it. And when you remember that, you thrive. And so the internet makes it easier to serve customers really well than ever before in history. And when you view the tool that way, it's an amazing tool, right? And that's what we've tried to do.
One of the things that really stands out about your brand, you go on your website, just read around online, is that giving is central to the mission of the company. Can you walk us through why it's so central to the company? And then also, to what extent do consumers realize that and value that, and that leads to loyalty? And is there a lesson that can be learned from other entrepreneurs who may be only financially motivated, that it is possible to do right and well at the same time?
Okay, there's a lot of different pieces to this. I'll start at the top. I wanted to feel like if I was funneling a bunch of my time into something that I'm making a difference. And I'm not always going to know. I'm usually not going to be able to see or know the people whose lives it makes a difference in, but I know that it's happening. We've picked some areas of focus. Our mission statement, as you mentioned, we exist to give generously. That's a very atypical mission statement. I think I have a very atypical career arc. I've spent about half my career in the nonprofit world, and I raised my salary. I spent half of it as an entrepreneur, and I think Simple Modern is a little bit of what you get if you kind of created some interesting hybrid of those two worlds. In some ways, there are aspects of what we do that are a little bit more like social entrepreneurship, like in the way that we think about certain things. But I really desired, when I lay down my head at the end of the day, that it's like, hey, it was worth it. It was worth it doing what I did today, and not just because the company made money. And there are a lot of people like me out there, is what I've learned. If you look at students graduating today, they are more cause-driven than ever before, and they have a higher desire to find meaning and purpose in their work than any previous generation. I think previous generations, there's that joke about America that Americans live to work and Europeans work to live. I really think in previous generations, I think of Americans, I think it really was like you tended to work to live. You had to support a family and you needed to have a job and you wanted to have job security. That's not the case with people that are graduating today. Like, people really do want their job. They want to be able to draw a straight line from, I put these hours in and it made this impact on the world. And I need to be able to mentally connect those two things to be motivated and excited about going to work. So by having a really clear sense of purpose, it really helps when it comes to recruitment and culture building because you have a very distinct flavor of what we're about. Good culture building is by definition exclusionary. It's by definition, it's about really strongly believing in things and being about things that not everybody would necessarily agree with. There's many people who would say, man, working at a company where they're explicitly telling me I'm probably making less money than I would make otherwise so that they can give away money. I don't love that. I don't want that. And that's fine. This isn't the right place for them. But there's definitely people that are like, man, for me, there's so much value in being able to know that what I'm doing is making a difference in other people's lives and impacting other people through the giving that I absolutely want to work there. I would absolutely take less money. And we've been able to define this. And we've really tried to be intentional. We compensate our people well. We have an employee stock ownership plan. But we've created a culture around people that are very excited about that idea of giving. We have a lot of people who have nonprofit background before they worked here. And then a lot of other people that, love nonprofits and love philanthropic work, but feel like they were supposed to be working in the business world. And this gives them an opportunity to kind of do both those things. So there's kind of the external side of it and the internal side of it. The internal benefits are immense. It is so much better when you really do have a rallying cry for your team of this is what we're about. One of my favorite stories to share is about Walmart buyers and the way that I don't know if they still do this, but the way they used to train Walmart buyers. And, when you're a Walmart buyer, let's say you're the Walmart buyer of paper clips or whatever, they're notoriously hard negotiators. Like they will grind to the fraction of the cent, right? And the way that they train these buyers is that when you're negotiating with a supplier, you have to mentally think about the millions of people that you're serving. And that if you can get that 1 penny of better cost, then you're functionally putting a penny in all those millions of customers that are going to buy paper clips from us over the next year. That you're doing that for them. You're arguing, you're negotiating on their behalf, and that is worth doing, and that is a worthy cause. And you can see why that would be motivating, right? That you can say, okay, yeah, like by me doing my job with excellence, millions of people's lives are made at least a little bit better. And I think we've had a similar thing here where it's like when we do our job with excellence, we know that it leads to less people being trafficked in India or, Africa. Well, we don't know those people, but like that's worthwhile. When we do our job with excellence, we know another district in Nigeria has clean drinking water. We know that more students in Oklahoma get quality education and have a better potential, future. And you can go down the list of all the different things that we focus on, but that is very motivating. And we recruit around that type of personality. This is also probably why we have very low turnover, very, very low turnover. I think a big theme as the internet's made it easier for people to switch jobs, remote work has made it easier to get jobs wherever, that it's not just about can you attract talented people, it's can you attract and hang on to talented people. High-performing teams, their number one characteristic isn't raw talent. It is a combination of talent and time together. And this is what made the Warriors so special. It wasn't just that they had Klay Thompson and Curry and Draymond Green. It was that those guys played together for several years and knew where each other would be on the court. And this is the way that high-functioning business teams are. They're highly talented, but then they've also worked together long enough to really unlock something special. Externally, we've actually done a pretty bad job of messaging this. We've really wrestled for years, like, do we even tell people about the giving we're doing, or do we just do the right thing? And I think that we've come to, this is something we should talk about because people will be excited about it. We're going to be rolling out some new branding in the upcoming year where we're going to be a lot more direct in telling people what we do. One of the stats that we'll share is that since inception, we've given away $10 million to the different causes. My goal is in the next 5 or 6 years that will become more than $100 million given away. And there's 2 reasons why I think it's important for us to be really public about what we're doing. The first is that I think the more that customers understand what you're about, the more that they will want to vote for you with their wallets. And that allows us to give more. So absolutely, unapologetically, if we can make the company more profitable and bigger by talking about the work we're doing, as long as it's authentic, then I want to do it. And we're really upfront about that. Like, I do not think we do it perfectly, but it is sincere. It is authentic. It is really what motivates us. The second reason actually doesn't have anything to do with us at all. It has to do with the impact that we can make on other businesses. I think we're at a particular juncture of time where capitalism can and should evolve, that there is a higher social contract and we should expect more from our businesses. And that part of that is that they view their profits and the responsibility that comes with their profits as part of the social contract, is that we're reinvesting some of that in the communities that make this possible. And so if by being public about our giving and our mission, if other aspiring CEOs, if other companies look at that and say, wow, maybe we could implement some of that stuff, then I can make far more impact than we can ever make by ourselves in giving. Maybe we can give hundreds of millions away over the course of the company's lifetime, and that would be great. But that pales in comparison to the amount of impact in giving that could be possible if we can help educate people and create a new paradigm about the way that for-profit companies can approach impacting the world and impacting communities. And so that's the other reason why we're going to be much more upfront about what we're doing going forward.
Well, Mike, that's tremendous and incredibly inspiring. And I think it's a testament to the culture that you've built. That I've been here for a few hours this morning, and every single person who walked in the building had a smile on their face and seemed happy. And it just really struck me that in this beautiful building that you guys have crafted here, that you've built something really special, that the people who are part of your organization, it provides tremendous meaning for their life. And I think that, at least for me as an entrepreneur, that's something that I aspire to one day.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the kind words. And one of the things that I say to aspiring entrepreneurs all the time is that I think we live in a culture that tends to worship scale. And I don't think that's really the way that we should think about things. Like, I think instead what we should do is we should lift up companies and people that are doing the right thing and about the right things, regardless of the scale of that. It's been fun that Simple Modern has gotten to a scale where it's really recognizable, that we're able to have the big building and the lots of employees. But I think it would be worth holding up even if it was 3 of us. And that would be the encouragement to anybody listening to this. You don't have to build a company that does hundreds of millions in revenue to be doing something really significant. And that scope and scale is often a little bit outside of our control. But what we do control is the way that we approach building companies and the mission and the authenticity behind that. And that if you invest your time in serving customers and building something with a clear mission where there's real values and real authenticity, that regardless of what scale it gets to, I think you're going to feel proud of that at the end of your career. And that's what I've used as kind of the litmus test for me. When I'm 70 and I'm looking back, am I going to feel good about the way I used my time? And I think the answer is yes. And it's not because of how big we've gotten, but it's rather because of what we've been about. So I appreciate the kind words.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Midcon Markup. Please hit like and subscribe for more episodes.